I've turned on the audio, so it is now recording. And could I also...
It's ringing, apparently. It seems to be ringing.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's somewhere else.
That's somewhere else.
I belong to the BSFA, as we were told since 1963. I also belong to the London Science Fiction Research Group that meets, I should plug this, it meets here every, on the first, at 7 o'clock on the first Monday of every month, unless there's an annoying bank holiday in the way, in which case we meet a week later. You're all very welcome. It does require some work, however, in the sense of this is quite a serious discussion of individual books. Last time we discussed Susan Hayden Elgin's novel Native Tongue. Monday after next we're discussing Lagoon by Nnedi Okorafor. If you're seriously interested in science fiction, if you'd like serious discussion about books, come along. We have a different book every month. The theme this year is communication, particularly with aliens, but not necessarily with aliens. We're still in the process of deciding what the theme is going to be next year. There is a Facebook page. You can find out what's happening. But you're very welcome. Okay, thank you to the BSFA for asking me to interview Charlie. I like space opera. I like occult thrillers. I really rather like sort of those romps between timelines and alternate histories and things. So it follows sort of naturally, really, that I like Charlie. I like his work. I mean, I don't like that person. I really like his work. And I've been reading it since it first came out. It sort of surprised me in the sense how recent that is. I mean, I've known Charlie since the early 90s. Met him at a science fiction event, I can't remember which one, possibly a Mexicon or something, I don't know.
Yeah.
But he published an Interzone a long time ago, but his first novel, I hope I'm right here, was published in 2003, which is actually not very long ago.
It was the first novel that actually escaped. There was a very close run thing in the mid-90s when a novel called Scratch Monkey nearly came out from Millennium, but due to a freeway communications error between myself, my agent Maggie Noah and the editor, the deal didn't quite come together. So I sort of kept failing. The first 15 years of my writing career, from my first short story sale to Interzone in 1985, was basically a smoking crater. So in the late 90s I realised I hadn't been writing enough lately. I'd been selling even less in the way of short fiction. I'd never successfully sold a novel. It was time to get serious about it or give up and go home. So I came up with a few simple principles. What does one do? Well, you start trying to sell short stories to the big, famous, important magazines in America like Asimov's or Analog, which are the ones people pay attention to. This is after 15 years of selling to Interzone, so I did give it a go on the home turf first. You write novels. Each novel should potentially be the first in a series, but then you send it out and go to the American publishers because, as the famous bank robber said when asked why he robbed the banks, he says, because that's where they keep the money. But never write book 2 of that series. Always go and write the first book of another series, because the second book of the series is going to be utterly useless to you if book 1 doesn't sell. Yeah. So I wrote a number of novels and kept sending them out and sent short stories out, and then I found myself on the hook for 3 successful series, because they all sold. This was not in the plan.
I think we're going to, what I would like to do for most of this interview at least, or conversation as the BSFA calls it, most of this conversation is to talk about 2 of those series, partly because the latest book in one of those series, the Laundry File series, is being launched tomorrow, and there is a signing at Forbidden Planet, yes?
That's right.
And the other, that's the 7th in the, am I right? The 7th? Yes. In the Laundry File series, and the 7th in the Merchant Princes series is being published later this summer.
No, it's being published in January next year.
Oh, sorry.
It's in production at present.
It's in production. Okay, January.
We
won't know. January, summer, it's all the same as far as we've written. So, it's imminent anyway, and I've read a draft of it, so I sort of know what happens, and I can spoil it for you totally. if you wish. But it's interesting how long ago these series started. His first novel, which was Singularity Sky, came out in 2003. The first Merchant Princes books came out in 2004. The first of the Laundry Files novels, The Atrocity Archives, came out in 2004.
So it came out in 2001 in a really obscure, small Scottish magazine. In Spectrum. Yeah.
Okay, came out in book form.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have been more pedantic. It came out in book form so that the rest of the world outside Scotland could read it in 2004. So, that's quite significant. It's 12 years ago both these series started. They're still going strong. And you've got plans for both of them, sort of long-term plans for both of them, yeah?
Yes. The new Merchant Princes book, Empire Games, I believe it's going to be sold as the first of the Empire Games trilogy rather than as more Merchant Princes. But it is a continuation of an existing series. And I said trilogy, didn't I? Yeah, there's 3 of them at various stages of production, but they'll be coming out at 1-year intervals. As for the Laundry, while the Nightmare Stacks comes out tomorrow, there's another one after it called the Delirium Brief that comes out in June next year, which is substantially written. It needs a final edit past to finish it, and then it's done. I will be taking a year or 2 off for Laundry after writing that one, because they were originally 1 every 3 to 5 year jobs, and I've just written 3 in consecutive years, and I'm a bit burnt out. But the provisional plan is a 12-book series. It was originally going to be just 1 standalone novel, and then but you know what happens to those, So what you're about to get is book 7 of the ongoing trilogy.
We've been waiting for several volumes now for the bloody end of the world to happen. Is it actually going to happen at the end of book 12?
Actually, we get a very big clue that the hammer has been dropped in book 8. And books 9 to book 12 is seeing if anybody survives. But I think it's reasonable to say that while everybody in the Laundry is waiting for Case Nightmare Green, the postulated end of the world, in book 7 they're blindsided by Case Nightmare Red, which is a different end of the world scenario.
What happens in that?
Well, Bob Howard, our protagonist, is sort of gradually developing seniority, experience, and cynicism as he progresses. And from fairly early on, he had heard about this thing called Case Nightmare Green, which is, as the Lovecraftian apocalypse nears, as the stars come right, magic gets easier and easier to perform computationally. To the point where people begin acquiring powers, where stuff that was previously impossible, very difficult, becomes trivial for teenage script kiddies, in effect. And the result is we end up basically killing each other off. As he discovers in book 6, or rather as his wife Mo discovers in book 6, the Annihilation Score, Case Nightmare Green is one part of a portfolio of problems called Case Nightmare Rainbow. And we get a bit more of a quantification of Case Nightmare Rainbow in book 7, the Nightmare Stacks. Case Nightmare Red is the alien invasion scenario. The increase in computational and magical density of Earth effectively sets up a neon-lit buffet sign saying, all you can eat buffet here to extra-dimensional invaders. And, of course, the extra-dimensional invasion takes place in book 7. Now, I should add, the first 4 of the novels were pastiches of British spy thriller writers. Len Dayton, Ian Fleming, Anthony Price, although that was a bait and switch, I originally meant it to be Elliston Trevor, a.k.a. Adam Hall, and then Peter O'Donnell, author of Modesty Blaze. But I got bored. And I switched in book 5, Varissa's Chart, to pastiching urban fantasy subgenres. So Varissa's Chart is the vampire novel. Then I did Echoid, the unicorn novella, which I'm told has spoiled My Little Pony Friendship is Magic forever. The Annihilation Score was the superhero novel, and the Nightmare Stacks is the elven novel.
Oh. They're very weird.
Or pointy-eared fuckers, as one more employee puts it.
Evil.
Yes. Yeah. I decided that elves were quite obviously another species of gracile hominid from another universe who had done unto our ancestors what our ancestors are postulated to have done unto the Neanderthals. I went into a fair bit of evolutionary sociobiology of how they use magic and what sort of social structures came out of it. Let's just say they're nasty. What I came up with... Okay. Hands up here. Everybody who's read Lords and Ladies by Terry Pratchett?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when one is talking British fiction and lazy stereotypes of German people, if you're going to write lazy stereotypes of German people, there are two British lazy German stereotypes you can deploy. One of these is loosely lederhosen, dirndls, beersteins and singing. And the other of them is SS Panzer Division Das Reich on the Eastern Front in winter of 1943. I'd now like you to imagine that every elven novel you've ever read, including Lords and Ladies, is the lederhosen, beersteins, dirndls and singing version. And I'm doing the SS Panzer Division. Is that about right? Yeah.
And you destroy your hometown
Yeah.
in the process.
I destroy Leeds. Not just Leeds either, large chunks of West Yorkshire. I drop an airliner on Otley.
I said I wasn't going to sort of look at your early history. And although I should say, actually, if you go to Wikipedia, the very first footnote in the Wikipedia article on Charlie is a very witty and entertaining account of Charlie's sort of pre-publication career. Your career as a pharmacist, your career as a computer programmer, your career as a writer for computer magazines and so on. It's very funny. And it's the only sort of autobiography I've ever seen where the highlights, the turning points of his career come with the appearance of new computer hardware and new computer programs. Anyway, go there if you want to learn about that. But why destroy your hometown? Did you hate Leeds so much?
Well, I grew up there and escaped as soon as I could. As my last editor, Ace, put it, Charlie, why did it take you so long? I mean, it's normal for authors to destroy their hometown of their first novel. Why did it take you so long? Susan, I believe in delayed gratification. There are places, I will grant you, that deserve destruction more than Leeds, but Leeds is somewhere on my personal list for Room 101.
Can we go back to the sort of beginning of the Laundry Files? The Atrocity Archive originally was in a magazine. It became the Atrocity Archives with an S when you added the Concrete Jungle. It's interesting that Charlie's 3 Hugo wins came, 2 of them were laundry novellas, which sort of indicates how popular the Laundry series has been. Even if a novel hasn't won it, 2 of your novellas have.
Yeah, and a couple of the short stories have also been nominated, but didn't win.
So where did it all start from? Did it start from thinking about Lovecraft?
Actually, it started from an earlier novelette I wrote called The Cold War. Now, A Cold War is something I began to work on in 1992, not long after the end of the Cold War. And it was going to originally to be an alternate history novelette that was trying to condense a sense of alienation I felt from the whole Cold War ethos by putting it in an alternate history. And I couldn't quite make it work, and I put it on the shelf for about 3 or 4 years, and then came back to it in 1996 and realised what this needs is Lovecraftian horror. Because, on the one hand, it's kind of hard to convince people who are youngsters today just how terrifying it was growing up in your teens in the 1980s. The prospect that at any moment your face could be burned off and everybody you know die horribly was a result of an obscure ideological disagreement among vast, cool impersonal intelligences a great distance away from you. It was kind of really, really creepy and cold and strange. And during the period when I wasn't working on this novelette, I reread At the Mountains of Madness and suddenly realised, hang on, I wanted an alternate history. Well, here's an alternate history. If you postulate that At the Mountains of Madness was historically accurate, what would have happened afterwards? Well, we know what would have happened. There'd have been a race to exploit the city of the old ones on the icy plateau in Antarctica. And they would have been looted, and the relics would have been carted away, and they'd have been turned into Cold War weapons. So I ended up with this very episodic, rather strange novelette from a point of view of a CIA analyst who's gotten sucked into this, and there are various bits of tongue-in-cheek, or should I say squid-in-cheek humour. Mr. President, we cannot permit a shog-off cap to emerge. As the United States and the Soviet Union, circa the mid-1980s, at one point we had Colonel Oliver North shipping Lovecraftian weapons to Afghanistan. They're teetering on the edge of the abyss, and eventually they slip over the abyss and begin deploying Lovecraftian horrors as weapons, up to and including Cthulhu. And it worked really well, but it was definitely a nice, cheerful, optimistic story to set your wrists to. And a bit later, I was thinking, I could do something more with this, but it's far too gloomy and downbeat. Now, cut away to another of my pet obsessions. I've always been a bit of a fan of the classic British Cold War spy thriller. I mentioned how the early laundry novels were pastiches of spy thrillers. And during the .com #1 period, when I was working in a successful .com as a #1 programming hire, the writing was to some extent on the back burner and something I was doing as a pressure relief valve. I thought, what if you're sort of .com's geek, sandal-wearing, Slashdot-reading hacker dude? What if he's in one of these universes where magic is a branch of applied computation, there's a secret service for dealing with this, and he just falls into it. And you then have room for a 1960s screwball comedy set in the middle of a Len Dayton spy agency, with tentacles coming out of the wall periodically. That's where the Atrocity Archive sort of began. But by the time it sort of escalated to its climax on a wrecked planet where the atmosphere has turned to liquid because the sun's been eaten by an ice giant and Hitler's face is carved in the moon, it had sort of taken on a bit of a life of its own.
Why did you... I mean, you gave up the pastiche business after 4 novels. Why did you stick with it so long?
Well, actually, I switched gear on the pastiches. It seemed to make... Well, okay. The Concrete Jungle wasn't overtly a pastiche. The Concrete Jungle was... Golden Griffin, an American publisher, originally said, we're doing a series of novellas, can you write us a novella? I said, sorry, too busy. But I've got this short novel I can send. So I sent them the Atrocity Archive. This was after its British serialisation, but before it had ever been a book. They said, this is really, really great, but it's too short to be one of our books. Can you write us a novella to go with it? So I ended up doing the novella. And in the fullness of time, the Atrocity Archives was published, and somehow the Concrete Jungle went viral and won a Hugo. I don't know why. That year's Hugo shortlist, I looked at the competition and realised that the book had fewer sales by an entire order of magnitude than everything else on the shortlist. So I yelled at the editor and said, you've got to put this on the internet. Oh, must we? Yes, otherwise nobody will read it and vote for it. These days that's received wisdom. But anyway, to cut a long story short, after the book had acquired a Hugo, Ace, my American publisher, said, I think we were going to pick up the paperback rights to this. And then Golden Griffin came back and said, would you be interested in writing another novel? At which point, all I could think of was, write me one just like the last, only different. I know what I've done, Len Dayton. Let's do Ian Fleming / James Bond. And I have to this day not seen any of the Casino Royale or subsequent new Bonds, because I burnt my brain out on James Bond, watching 16 Bond movies in a row and critique them analytically with a friendly indie film producer in the space of 2 months. Do not do this to yourself. I actually flowcharted the Bond movie structure, right down to the opening sequence, then did something different. But that's where the Jennifer Moore came.
So it wasn't Ian Fleming, it was the movies. It
was the movies primarily. In fact, it wasn't even so much the movies as the reader's reaction to the movies. It takes something of a revisionist stance on the movies.
And the third one, the Fuller Memorandum, that was inspired by a pastiche of Anthony Price. I must confess I have never read an Anthony Price novel, should I?
Yes, you're missing something.
Okay.
He's relatively obscure now because he stopped writing when the Cold War ended. He was about 80 when the war came down. A television series was made based on the books, but it never gained movie traction and it was never big in America. but he was one of the finest of the British Cold War spy thriller writers from about 1960 to about 1985. In particular, his spies work for an organisation called Research and Development. They are very, very academic. His primary character, David Audley, is a historian by training, and there's usually an awful lot of research in dusty library archives, and then suddenly a gun comes around the corner and shoots a researcher in the head because they've stumbled across something everybody's forgotten for 50 years with drastic implications. And that's sort of how Anthony Price novels are structured. In the case of the Fuller Memorandum, I was originally going to do an Adam Ball Quiller novel, but was reading Anthony Price at the time and fell in love with his prose style and went for him instead. As for the one after that, is everybody here vaguely familiar with Modesty Blaze?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The Apocalypse Codex was the Modesty Blaze novel.
I saw a lot of people whose heads were not shaking it or nodding at that.
Okay.
Modesty Blaze is a figure from distant past, as far as I know.
1960s through 1980s.
Okay.
Originally a newspaper comic strip, then a series of novels by Peter O'Donnell. She is a war refugee who comes out of the Balkans as a small kid, an orphan. She ends up drifting into a crime gang in Marseille, graduates to run the most deadly jewellery and theft and cat burglary gang in Marseille and the Mediterranean, then retires to London with her henchman Willie Garvin, who's a former British Army deserter turned, I think, French Foreign Legion guy. But she tends to get bored because she'd made her $250,000, this was in 1960 money, and the head of MI5 knows she's there and uses her for deniable jobs by just running something past her that gets her attention, which is very much like running a brightly feathered lure on a stick past the nose of a cat.
She's in the novel, the Modesty Blaze character is called Persephone Hazard.
There's
a rather seedy villain in Jennifer Morgan, who's called Pat McMurray. There is a sort of henchman who's called Pete Young. There's a sort of pattern, but for those who know British fandom, there's a sort of pattern building there. I know Pat, I know Pete, I know Persephone.
Pat was asking for it. In fact, Pat won a raffle for it.
I was wondering how it came about. Are there any other characters in there from real life that I haven't recognised? Apart from those three?
Probably not. I try to be very, very careful about that sort of thing these days, especially since I began getting diplomatically worded emails from my editor Orbit, who, after the books had been run past Orbit legal department, say, please can you make sure that there is no way that this Home Secretary can be mistaken for Jackie Smith or Theresa May? So there isn't. I made sure to specify the hair colour and eye colour correctly.
So the first four, really, the pastiches should be seen as a sort of quartet, and then you move on to
a new series of
sort
pastiches.
urban fantasy pastiches.
I will confess, as of book 8, I've run out of things to pastiche. If you remember the first two Discworld novels, The Colour of Magic and The Light Fantastic, Terry was basically ringing the numbers on pastiches of different fantasy tropes. Then, by the time he got on to book 3, Discworld had sort of acquired a life of its own. The Laundry has been acquiring momentum and a life of its own all along. And there have been outbreaks of, this is not a pastiche, from The Concrete Jungle onwards. Book 8, The Delirium Brief, is very definitely a thing in and of itself, rather than a pastiche. But I may go back and do more pastiches if I can think of anything that needs doing. That's crying out.
You stuck with Bob Howard as the point of view character, for the first 5 novels?
Yeah.
I thought he was a great character. Why did you? I mean, all right. So Mo is a great character as well. Mo is the point of view character in the sixth novel.
Mm-hmm.
Fine, but you seem to have dumped Bob altogether.
No, I haven't. What it was, though, is there's a problem you get in any series work where you stick with one protagonist. Either you have to hit a reset button at the end of every episode, much like Star Trek, or you have an ongoing story arc that builds from book to book, and your protagonist gets more and more powerful. Games Parliaments may level up. By book 5, I realised Bob had levelled up to the point at which he could walk into a nest of vampires and walk out again with his hair mussed. But, you know, he's not exsanguinated and bleeding in a corner. He was a bit too powerful and a bit too knowledgeable. So I thought, cut away from Bob for a bit. Now, Mo started out in book 1 as, unfortunately, the princess in the castle. Then in book 2 I realised this was a really bad thing to do and figured out, no, she doesn't like being princess of the castle. What's she going to do? She's going to turn herself into something else. And in the background, she's been turning herself into something else throughout the first 5 books. And book 6 is a very useful tool because it allows me to... Bob is an unreliable narrator. He has an overinflated opinion of himself and he's a bit willfully blind to his own failings. Mo, who's been married to him for 8 years at this point, is very definitely not blind to Bob's failings. And we get a unvarnished perspective on him from the outside, which I think is a bit healthy, but boy, did I get hate mail for it. Oh, yeah. Book 6, the Annihilation Score, is the Mo novel, it's the superhero novel. She and Bob have separated because of a slight argument between her violin and Bob. Her violin wants to eat Bob. Bob might accidentally eat her soul by sleepwalking. They both become somewhat monstrous. So they're living apart, and Mo is under enormous stress, and in a misguided attempt to help her deal with the stress after her cover is blown live in front of the BBC News 24 camera crew, she is handed an assignment, a fake cover as an agent of MI5, and sent to the Home Office to set up and run a small consulting team for dealing with the superhero menace. Note I say superhero menace. What does the Home Office generally think of vigilantes?
Nothing good.
Nothing good. So, of course, she is given the unpalatable duty of trying to set up and run a small official Home Office superhero team who will be trained and deputised as special constables and sent to fight crime. And, of course, someone is messing with her head in the process, as she discovers when she's assigned Bob's ex-girlfriends as her executive officers, and a liaison officer from the Association of Chief Police Officers, who is not all that he appears to be. And she's under such immense pressure that she's actually on the slides to a full-blown nervous breakdown throughout the book. The nervous breakdown arrives right at the end, right after the climax. So partly it's a serious introspective, sensitive examination of a midlife crisis, a marital breakdown, and a nervous breakdown with superheroes. The other elevator pitch of this was Bob's exes form a superhero team and fight crime. But it also allowed me to do an examination of Bob from the point of view of him not being there, while also filling in a bunch of the gaps by looking at Mo. And also, you know, the laundry at this point had taken on a life of its own. It's not just a one-person story. It's actually a world of its own, and Bob is just one part of it. We get back to Bob in Book 8, incidentally. Book 8 is the next Bob novel. Book 7 is about an entirely different protagonist in turn, Alex, the somewhat nerdy mathematician and banker turned vampire from the Rhesus chart.
That was a surprise. When I started, I've read Nightmare Stacks, and it's great fun. But it was a shock because I thought, it's going to be. I assumed it was going to be another Mo novel. Well, she doesn't appear at all, I think, or
neither does Bob.
No, he's mentioned, but I don't think she's mentioned even. So you're going to pull the same one in number 8, did you say? Or
no, number 8 is back to Bob with a little bit more of an ensemble cast. Various other laundry personnel get a lot more face time in it. It's not just Bob, although it's still Bob's workplace diaries. The elevator pitch for this one is Bob has to grow up and wishes he didn't. He's facing grown-up levels of problem now, having to go above his pay grade, as it used to be. Well, outside his comfort zone. Book 8 opens with Bob in a suit being frog-marched into Broadcasting House in London and locked in a TV broadcast studio to be interviewed live on Newsnight by Jeremy Paxman. Because nobody else is available to do the job. they're all dead or suspended pending a parliamentary inquiry into just what went wrong in Yorkshire.
You're going to tell us how he survived Paxman?
No, I'll leave that as a that would be a spoiler for chapter 1.
Okay, fine. Okay, let's. We spent 25 minutes or so thinking about laundry. I'd like to move to the other one, the other series, where Volume 7 is going to be coming out in January, Empire Games. Merchant Princes, I mean, in a sense, the laundry series is a sort of natural for a British writer. It has a computer nerd as a hero. Sorry, I'm not implying you're a computer nerd, but you make that.
Yeah.
You certainly appear like that sometimes. The Family Trade, which is the first of the Merchant Princes series, has a young Boston woman as the protagonist. The Merchant Princes is definitely an American series. Did you get any adverse criticism from Americans on this? How well do they think you performed in doing an American science fiction series?
Oh, I have had fair amounts of snarky feedback on one aspect or another all along, but usually for the most part minor detail work, and I'm always able to blame the American copy editors for letting stuff slip through they're not supposed to have. Now, where the Family Trade came from, let us rewind the clock to 2001, when Charlie has just been signed by Ace, an American publisher, on a shiny new 2-book deal for Singularity Sky and Iron Sunrise, space operas. And Prince Otto von Bismarck said that anyone who's interested in sausages or laws should take great pains to pay no attention to how either of them are made. The same should be said of readers and books. It is quite common in a publishing contract with an author for there to be an option clause where the publisher says, oh, and you've got to send your next novel to us for first refusal after these two. Because publishers are trying to build a career, not just buy individual books. So there was an option clause in my contract for these two space operas. And I was doing a lot of freelance journalism and hand-to-mouth stuff at the time because the dot-com bust had kicked in and I was resting between jobs, shall we say, and writing away. And I just handed in Iron Sunrise, and Caitlin, my agent, said, well, that's a really good book, Charlie, and they'll do well with it, but Singularity Sky isn't going to be out until 2003, and there is no way they'll even look at your next novel until they have a year's sales figures. So you can't write and sell a science fiction novel to anybody else. How about you write a big fat alternate history or fantasy series I can sell to somebody else? This is how you finesse it. You're not breaking the option if you sell something in an entirely different field. At least that was her theory, and she made it stick. Anyway, so my agent Caitlin is great. She used to be an editor herself, so what I do is I pitch story ideas at her, and she says, that doesn't work, or that's too weird, and so on. So I threw a couple at her, and she said, no, that's too weird. I have a pathological difficulty in doing your classic high fantasy. I already had the sort of urban fantasy thing covered with the laundry, so it looked like alternate history or portal fantasy or something. And I finally came up with this idea of, well, principle number 1, steal from the best. Steal. Don't be embarrassed, just steal. Number 2, make sure they're already dead before you steal from them, or they'll accuse you of plagiarism. Number 3, don't steal from one person, steal from 2 or more, and then mash them together, then you look original. So my first target was Roger Zelazny, obviously enough, people who travel between parallel universes by thinking themselves between them. But, you know, Roger Zelazny's Court of Amber, they're massively powerful, they're pretty much gods. No, let's pare it right back to the absolute minimum viable product for travelling between timelines. The other principle, steal from somebody else, well, H.B. Piper's Paratime. Use something not unlike that as a setting. It's multiple explicitly separate parallel universes, people who can move at will between them, but with strict limits. What twist? Well, normally we think of travel between parallel universes, or directed portal travel, as it were, as something people from our world go into another world to do. What if it's people from a much more primitive world coming into ours? Stand the paradigm on its head. And that's basically how I began writing Family Trade. And I wrote this big 600-page book called The Family Trade, in which long-lost daughter of noble family discovers her roots, and then discovers to her horror that she's grown up in Boston as a tech journalist, discovers to her horror they expect her to grow up and be a duchess, marry who they tell her to, and pop out babies in an unheated castle. Her response is to say, sod that for a game of soldiers, I'm going to go find a new timeline and pioneer a new business model. Because it's all about economics. And David Hartwell liked it a lot, bought it, and then said, by the way, Charlie, your book's too fat. Can you chop it in two? You've got a week. So, and also because of the option clause, this thing, which was a fairly hard-headed look at parallel universe travel and how you build a business between timelines and the failure modes of economic development in different timelines, ended up with this. I think I can safely say this is a high fantasy book cover. Bella at Toy UK has republished them in omnibus form, where we pretty much reassembled the books into the original big fat form and gave them a much more thriller-oriented branding. They actually work a lot better in the current revised form. But it was one part your classic portal fantasy trope, and 3 or 4 parts of playing out the economic and logistic implications of parallel universe travel, and then what happens when the Drug Enforcement Agency in America discovers that their main heroin connection for New England is extra-dimensional narco-terrorists. Take it seriously and see where it goes.
It didn't. The cover, yes, the cover is a fantasy cover, as you say. The novel itself didn't seem to me like fantasy at all. And as you say, H.B. Piper was one of the inspirations.
Yeah, it was written very much as, I guess, soft-edged SF. There's a science fictional conceit under it, and it's played straight as science fiction, but can be read as fantasy if you want to read it as fantasy. Not so much with the new trilogy, though.
Are you going to tell us anything about the new trilogy?
Okay.
Of course you are.
If
not, I will tell you all about that.
Okay.
There is a very, very strong hint in the new one that it is science fiction, and that it's going to be big. All that space operatic science fiction.
Yeah. Brief show of hands. So how many people are familiar with the Merchant Prince's series? Okay, so quite a few of you. Those of you who've read to the end of the first series will be familiar with the fact that all does not end well for the clan. I think there's something like 2.5 nuclear wars in the last book. An awful lot of mushroom clouds. Empire Games picks up the story 17 years later in the United States, where in 2003 the White House was destroyed with the president in it, using a nuke stolen from the US inactive inventory. There was a nuclear attack on the Capitol at the same time, and an abortive nuke attack on the Pentagon, carried out by extra-dimensional narco-terrorists. You can imagine the level of fear and loathing that this would have induced. You know, it would make 9/11 look like a storm in a teacup. Towards the end of that novel, the phrase is uttered, President Rumsfeld's America. So, by the year 2020, they've pretty much recovered from the psychotic break, but not before. They have a national identity register, a mandatory national DNA database, CCTV cameras monitoring every street corner for world walkers appearing out of nowhere, and the Department of Homeland Security has responsibilities for defending the United States against threats from all other parallel universes. And it turns out that such threats do in fact exist. And that's just in the first 3 or 4 chapters.
So it's been published, it was originally published in 6 volumes, it was then republished as a trilogy of 3 very fat volumes. What is the next? The next one is going to be a trilogy too, is it?
It's a trilogy, but of somewhat smaller books. I hope Bella doesn't hate me for saying this, but my view of it is, it was my chance to write a big fat Neil Stephenson-sized doorstop with 2 dotted lines down the spine. It is one continuous story, although the novels do sort of stand alone as novels within a trilogy. But they build on each other. And it's very much a what are the consequences 17 years later of everything that happened in the first series, much as the last 4 books of the original 6 were the consequences of what happened in the first 2 books. Loosely, Miriam, our heroine, while trying to deal with an unpalatable situation, the first 2 books lets all the pigeons out of a dovecot. And they come back in books 4 to 6 and do what pigeons do. They make an awful mess everywhere. And by books 7 to 9, oh dear God, it's not just pigeons anymore. It's the really unpleasant predators they've attracted. We have a number of timelines, and those of you who've read the first series may remember the New British Empire, this sort of vaguely steampunky alternate North America, where the Industrial Revolution had happened a couple of hundred years late because there was no US War of Independence. We get a lot more of that timeline in this one. They've had their revolution. They're called the New American Commonwealth, and we meet Miriam again, getting the phone call to confirm they put their first spy satellite into orbit. They've been playing technological catch-up for 17 years, and when they make first contact with the United States, not only do they have a head of state whose instructions to his Politburo is find a way to save the United States of America for democracy, but there's going to be parallel universe travel and nukes on both sides. As I said, I've always had an affection for Cold War spy thrillers.
The New American, is it the New American Commonwealth?
Yes.
Basically makes about 100 years of technological progress in 50 or 60.
Actually, no, they don't.
It felt like that. And
it feels like that, but appearances are deceptive. In the original book, Miriam sees a very steampunky-looking environment with cobbled streets and steam cars and biplanes overhead. But if you step out of a time machine set to 1942 in North America, you'd go out onto the streets and you would see Model T Fords still beetling around, biplanes overhead as well, although some DC-3s, steam locomotives. You would not know that you'd stepped into a world that had ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons programs, and computers, but they'd be there in embryo. So, as William Gibson put it, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. The world Miriam had encountered was actually closer to the 1940s than the 1900s. Now, I've been looking a fair bit at technology transfer and rates of economic development, and an interesting thing is what happened to South Korea, or Japan after World War II. Japan made an astonishing great leap forward, first during the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century, and then again in the 1950s. More recently, South Korea did it. South Korea and North Korea were pretty much level pegging in 1970. They were both under fairly dictatorial military regimes. They were both, at best, sort of Eastern Bloc levels of development, not doing very well. Then somehow, in a 20-year period, South Korea made a great leap forward and actually exceeded the per capita GDP of Japan. They somehow actually managed to bridge the gap and jumped straight into developed world status. And I'm postulating that if you have a superpower that has just had a revolution and is in a state of ongoing emergency and existential crisis at war with another superpower, and if you give them an industrial espionage capability that can bring almost magical technology to bear from another universe, they will be able to make probably 2 to 2.5 years of progress per year of actual wall clock time, and that's what they're doing. They have actually reached about the mid-1970s from a 1940s starting point in 17 years. But of course, their 1970s are not our 1970s. And there are some roads not taken in our universe. For example, around 1960, a British aircraft company called Fairey was making a very interesting aircraft called the Fairey Rotodyne. I see a few eyebrows moving here, a few people have heard of it. It got cancelled by the Air Ministry for a couple of reasons, one of which was it was unbearably loud, and the customer for it, one of the domestic British carriers, I think British European Airways, envisaged using it to run helicopter services between the centres of cities. This was for something which had noise levels which would be appropriate only for a military plane. If I say it was about the size of the V-22 Osprey in a similar capacity, but in 1960, using rather simpler technology, it was basically potentially a very useful military vertical takeoff transport. This is something that was consigned to the dustbin of history in our history purely by a totally inappropriate series of managerial decisions that could so easily have happened. Again, Project Orion, Freeman Dyson and co.'s plan to build a nuclear pulse detonation-powered spacecraft. Not really feasible here, but if you're a superpower in the first throes of Cold War trouble, and if also you know where all these computers and electronics are going, you just make part of your national specification that all computers will be built with EMP shielding in the casing. Then you start building your space dreadnought. And so it goes.
Have you worked out what's going to happen in this trilogy? Is part of it already written?
Yes. Book 2 is very, very nearly complete. There's just a couple of edits to deal with before it's finalised by the end of this year. Book 3 exists in first draft. The ending sags a bit, so part of my job next year is to rewrite the last half of Book 3. But substantially, it's complete. I know what the trilogy is about, I know where it's going, and there's a third of a million words there.
Your output over the since 2003, your output has been absolutely phenomenal. Are you going to continue at this rate?
Nah. And actually, I denied my output is phenomenal. I've been averaging about 1.5 novels per year, but you've got to bear in mind my novels tend to be relatively short. They're in the 100 to 120,000 word bracket. To put it in perspective, George R.R. Martin publishes about a book every 2 years, but he writes more words than I do. He writes faster than I do. It's just his books are enormous. In addition, there's always somebody who writes more. Everybody knows somebody who writes more than they do. There's one American author I know who, in a normal year, writes 6 times as much as I do in my best year ever. Roughly 10 times as much as I write in a normal year. So,
is it any good?
She has had 5 items on a Hugo shortlist under 2 pseudonyms in 1 year.
All right, now I know who you're talking.
So I think we can safely say she's at least competitive.
And have you got? I mean, when you finished, I mean, the Laundry series, you're planned to bring to an end at number 12. You're planning to bring Merchant Princes to an end with number 9.
I'm not sure. The Laundry is a bit of a movable feast. It was originally a standalone novel. Then, when the Jennifer Moore was commissioned, I thought it would be a trilogy. Then it began growing. At this point, I figured out what the overall story arc is, and I think it'll take 12 books. Now, The Merchant Princes is a bit different. Originally, it was written to a pitch for a tetralogy of really, really, really big, fat books. The first big, fat book came out as the first 2. The second big fat book sort of grew in the telling and ended up as the next 4. The third book, by which point it's sort of varied off the original outline, is the new trilogy. But I don't know if the fourth is going to be necessary or is ever going to be written. To some extent, there's an issue with impetus because the driving force behind the series was very much David Hartwell, the famous American editor who died this January. I'm absolutely committed to completing the current trilogy. I will then need a bit of time off to reevaluate. Do we want to go back and do more in the series? Before he died, I was in any case discussing with David, there's 1 million words of this material now. Holding it in my head is very, very difficult. I would much rather do standalone novels in continuity than huge sub-series where you're effectively dealing with a single story 1/3 of a million to 500,000 words long. I'd much rather do standalone novels. So I may well go back to it and use it as a setting in future. But I don't really want to get into plans beyond Book 9, as in any case, Book 9 will not come out before 2019?
At least, I think.
Yeah.
At least.
So we're talking quite a long way ahead.
And you are beginning to write a freestanding space opera?
Well, yeah. I get bored eventually, but more to the point, it is always an easy sell to sell a book that's a sequel to something you've already done. And that way comes a bit of a snare and a delusion and a trap. I haven't actually started a wholly new project set in a new universe all of its own since 2007. Since 2007, when I wrote Palimpsest, the time travel novella, I have done Rule 34, which was a sequel to Halting State, Neptune's Brood, which was a sequel to Saturn's Children, 3 more Laundry novels, 3 more Merchant Princes novels, and oddly, everything here is a sequel. So that's sort of 8 books in a row to sequels. So I'm in the process of moving to a new American publisher. Basically, I'm parting company from Ace, who've been publishing the Laundry Files and my main SF since 2003 now. And part of the deal, it's always easier to sell an original book to a new publisher. Very often publishers don't like to take on a series that's part way through. The Laundry Files is being picked up by a new publisher, in this case by Tor in America. It'll stay with Orbit in the UK, but I've had an itch to write something new for ages, and a chance to write a new space opera and make a clean break is something I want to go for. So, yeah.
So what's the space opera going to be? In what sense is it a space opera?
It's set 2/3 of a million years in the future.
Okay, that's a good start.
At a point where the entire local group of galaxies has been colonised. In a universe where there is one piece of magic that allows instantaneous travel. It is a device that can generate wormholes linking 2 volumes of space a fair distance apart. And a curious parameter of this device is there can only be one. The wormhole generator is a rivalrous resource in economics speak. While one such generator is operational, it suppresses any other within a radius of about 1 billion light years. So, immediately after it was switched on, the people running it became potentially infinitely rich, very, very secretive and very, very paranoid. Today, 2/3 of a million years in the future, they're known as the Authority. They do several things. They broadcast a universal time signal, because you need a time and coordinate system to specify where you want your wormholes to go and end. There is a trade language. There is a trade currency, because they want to be paid. Nobody knows where they live exactly, because if they did, you could send a battle fleet there and steal the wormhole generator and become infinitely rich. People who get that kind of idea tend to wake up dead one morning because the Authority, let's just say they are so rich and paranoid that they have a very, very scary secret police. But in general, they don't interfere with planetary governments. And as settings go, this is great. It allows me to have any number of interesting space operatic organisations bumping up against each other and bumping each other off as well. Which brings me to the news story, which I don't really want to discuss at this point because I'm about a quarter of the way into the first draft of it. But it starts off as a tale of academic skullduggery, and then the religious fanatics turn up and blow up the world, and then it goes into gear.
So, when are you going to finish this? By the sixth volume, the 7th volume?
Actually, okay, I said steal from the best and make sure they're dead first. I'm going to try and steal shamelessly from Ian M. Banks. Insofar as I want this to be a playground universe I can revisit, but each novel will be a standalone. Yeah.
Okay. That has taken us into the, not exactly, how many million years in the future is this?
2/3 of a million years. I wanted Star Trek aliens, as in the latex space paint, but not totally incomprehensible Greg Egan or Peter Watts aliens. 2/3 of a million years is far enough of human species to have subspeciated, for there to be different human subspecies living in different biospheres on different planetary environments in different ecosystems, and also genetically modified human subspecies where somebody with a bee in their bonnet about some aspect of human existence has tried to fix us for the better, and usually succeeded but introduced new and fascinating different problems at the same time.
That sounds intriguing. So that's taking us millions of years in the future. It's taking your career, 5, 6, whatever years into the future. Time for us to finish, I think.
Yeah.
And turn to you. to ask questions, not just on the series books, which I've been concentrating on, but if you've got questions about some of the standalone novels or short stories or anything, here's your chance.
So I want to ask about one novella you've